everybody. Welcome to the summary of Adult Forum. If you weren't able to join us this morning, we wanted to still be able to give you a little bit of an idea about what we talked about this week, so you'll be caught up with the story for next time. So, quick rewind. Let's talk about what we have already discussed. So last week we did chapter 2, which was about the story of that we talked about Noah.
Noah.
Yes.
And the Tower of Babel.
Then the Tower of Babel. There was another story along with that too. What was the other story? Oh, I've lost it. I knew earlier. It's been a while. Oh, Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. Oh, right. We started with Cain and Abel.
Adam and Eve have sons, Cain and Abel. And we talked about sibling rivalry that ends in the death of Abel, so that there is no more sibling rivalry. And then we have people are still misbehaving, and so God makes the covenant with Noah, and we have the ark and the animals, and then life after the flood and the Tower of Babel. And again, people are scheming, and so God says, all right, we've got to give them all different languages and scatter them about so that perhaps that will make them behave better. And didn't work. So
No.
So then today we got the call of the ancestor. The chapter 3 was the ancestor of a multitude, i.e. Abram and Sarai, that become Abraham and Sarah. And so we talk about God calls Abram and the birth of Ishmael and the renaming of Abraham and Sarah, and then Abraham bargaining and the birth of Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, and then the binding of Isaac. So we're going to go into those in a bit more detail. But before I do that, I'm going to let Father Stephen talk a little bit about the exegetical part, like the history of what's happening in the world during this time, and give us a little bit more detail behind the story themselves. So take it away, Father Stephen.
Okay, well, I'm going to share a screen. Well, maybe. I'm not seeing it. Okay. That's not. I thought I had that screen up. Just a minute. Okay. While I do, I'll look for this screen. Oh, here we go. Is it appearing?
Not yet.
Okay. Here we go.
Yes, now it's appearing.
Now it's appearing. Okay. Once we get through the Tower of the Babel, it's as if God says, okay, I'm through with trying to deal with the whole earth, the whole world. I'm just going to concentrate on one person and see if I can find one faithful person who will do something. And that person becomes Abram, or later Abraham. And he's told that if he leaves his family of origin and leaves his country of Ur, which in this map would be where Babylon and Sumer are, and Chaldea, that would be the ancient capital of Ur, or country of Ur. He's told if he leaves Ur and goes to a place that God will show him over here in Palestine, that God will make of him a great nation. And between Babylon on the right and the Nile River and Egypt on the left, you can see that Palestine was the trade route. And it was very chaotic at that point in time. Egypt was very, very settled. This is around the year 1800 BC. And Babylon is very, very settled. Ur, Sumer, Chaldea, they're very settled. But Palestine is in chaos, and yet you have to go through there, and not going across the desert, to be able to get to Egypt. So it was a dangerous thing that Abraham was doing, going to Palestine to become a great nation. He's leaving his home, leaving his people. So that was one exegetical piece we needed to know. Another piece we needed to know is about the birth of Ishmael. Women of means, all the way up until the Middle Ages, were able to claim children of their slaves that their slaves had with their husbands, who were men of means or men of power. The women could no longer conceive, then they would allow their slaves to conceive on their behalf, and the child would be theirs. The only thing is that you had to be there for conception and birth, which I know is kind of creepy. But that's what was happening.
I hadn't realized until you put this map up that when we talk about Hagar, and you can take it away, it's fine.
Okay.
Hagar and Sarah, that Sarah offers an Egyptian slave
Yes.
to Abraham, and so clearly Hagar is a slave that they have obtained since they arrived in Palestine.
Yes, since they've arrived in Palestine, and it's a deliberate kind of show that Abraham has enough authority to have an Egyptian slave.
Okay.
So here he's going from halfway to Egypt.
And they took slaves with them, so it wasn't just Abraham and Sarah heading off to the desert.
Oh yeah, it was a whole entourage with them.
Yes.
It was a whole entourage with them. And so I'm trying to think of the other exegetical pieces you need to know. Abraham argues with God quite a bit, and that's because the birth of an heir, it keeps being delayed and delayed and delayed. That's why he has a child, Ishmael, with Hagar. And perhaps the reason why Sarah wanted to send Hagar and Ishmael away is because Hagar was still in the community. And so she had to constantly look at this person whom she had have a child on her behalf. But of course, Hagar's really taking care of Ishmael and relating to Ishmael, not her.
Yeah.
So other thing we wanted to say is that Isaac is a bridge person when he gets born. He's a bridge between Abraham and Jacob. We know very, very little about him. Rebecca is the hero of his story, not Isaac. Also, you need to know from that map I displayed earlier that there is evidence that about the time of Abraham, 1800 years BC, there was a group of people in Babylon who believed in a single god or a great sky god who could not be depicted, who was in charge of everything. And there's evidence that these Babylonians moved to northern Palestine about that same time. So we do have evidence of the possible Abrahamic group.
Right.
Finally, I'll just say a little bit about Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. Most of the Bible and most scholars interpret this as Abraham's faith. He's faithful. God tells him to do something. He does it even though it's risky and horrifying, and God saves him because he sees his great faith. One standout does not agree, and that's Maimonides, the great Jewish medieval scholar, who says, no, this is a failure on Abraham's part, because Abraham constantly argues with God about having an heir. He even argues with God about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he won't argue with God when God says, sacrifice your son. And it is interesting that Maimonides does point out that after this encounter, Abraham and God never speak face to face again. So, a little bit of background.
Yes. So, we were talking about, so just to kind of summarize the actual stories that we read for this week, so that God calls Abraham, and so Abraham and Sarah at that point he's still Abram, and Sarai, his wife, and his brother's son Lot, and then all their possessions and all the persons whom they had acquired, they all leave together to go out into Canaan. And so then it notes that somewhere along the way, Abraham and Lot decide to separate. But I don't remember, as I mentioned earlier, Father Stephen, I don't remember there being anything in the story about like why they go separate ways. One would assume it is differing of familial opinions. But what was your take on why Abram and Lot go separate ways?
Their households grew as they moved through Palestine, either through birth or acquiring slaves, or there's one brief story about a battle that Abraham was involved in and that he won, and so may have won, some followers there. The assumption may be that both their entourages got too big for each other, and so they needed to be in different places. Okay. That's one of the arguments I've read.
So you talked a little bit about how Abraham is normally faithful. For the most part, he is faithful to God, but he still has some doubts, and he argues with God from time to time. And one of the ways in which we point out in the story that Abram is doubting is that he denies Sarah as his wife and says she's his sister.
Yes.
You want to say anything about that?
There are two instances in which this happens. This is when Abraham and Sarah are still young, and Sarah is very attractive, very attractive, and Abraham is afraid that these places that they're visiting that are not necessarily welcoming to strangers. Like I said, Palestine was pretty chaotic during the rise of Babylon, and Egypt, and when they came to great powers. So he tries to protect himself. He's afraid that the city king or the city leader will steal his wife for her beauty and kill him. So he says, she's really my sister. And so the king does take her anyway. So it's like, well, at least he didn't kill me, because, he keeps me alive as her brother instead of her husband. But in both instances, when they take Sarah in, a plague comes on the town. And Abraham has to confess what's really true, and they chase him away because they think they brought the plague on them because of this. So they're very strange stories, but I think they're included in the text to remind us all of the great leap of faith that Abraham is taking. He's going into this really chaotic land where his life and the life of his entourage is in danger.
And again and again and again and again.
Yeah, and again and again and again, over and over again.
God makes his promise to Abraham, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Again and again, he promises his faithfulness and reward basically to Abraham for following him. So you mentioned that, one of the ways in which they doubt is that, maybe it's more of Sarah's doubt, but that she will actually bear Abraham a child. She's older in years, and at 86, Sarah brings to Abraham Hagar, his Egyptian slave, and Hagar bears him a son, which Sarah claims as her own, given what you had said about the context of that. So Abraham now has a son, Ishmael. That's kind of a way of them doubting that, God will provide. Perhaps that this is what he means, is he will provide us with a fertile slave. So then God renames Abraham and Sarah. So they are no longer Abram and Sarai. And you want to say a little bit about what naming means?
Yes. This is a very important part of the ancient world. If you had the capacity to name something, it meant you had power over it. So God renaming somebody. This is true even in the New Testament, where Saul becomes Paul. It's a sign of God's power over that person. When Adam named all the animals in the garden, it was a sign of his control and power over them. So this is God's control and power over Abraham and Sarah.
And it's the second covenant that we've seen in a week. So last week, God makes a covenant with Noah, how do you say it? Noahic? Yeah, the Noahic covenant. And then this week we get the Abrahamic covenant. So this is the second time that God enters into covenant with a particular person for the means of his kingdom. Okay, and so then Abraham bargains for Sodom, for God not to wipe them out, right? If you find one, he keeps bringing God down.
If you find 50 good people, what about 25? What about 10?
I give you one faithful person. And God goes, all right, I'll spare them. But it was, yet the Lord was unable to find even 10 righteous people in the cities, and so God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. But Sodom and Gomorrah is actually where Lot had gone to, correct?
Right.
These are the formations of...
Yep. Lot's entourage went towards Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay. And we really don't talk about this a whole lot, and we didn't even touch on it in the earlier discussion, but it's one of the cool stories, is that Lot's wife, as they are leaving, she looks back, like God spares Lot and Lot's wife.
And his family and his entourage.
As long as they don't look back.
Yeah.
And Lot's wife looks back and turns to a pillar of salt. So we become the salt of the earth.
When we look back from nostalgia?
Yeah. So is there anything we should know more about the story of turning to salt when we look back?
Well, there's a number of stories, you know, you could take with it what you will, but a lot of scholars believe that because there are salt pillars in the wasteland between where Sodom and Gomorrah was and where civilization begins again, that, you know, they had to explain these salt pillars as human beings who got turned into salt because of their sinfulness. And the story of Lot's wife is the most dramatic. But it is about, you know, as I said in my sermon last week, nostalgia ain't what it used to be.
Don't look back.
So don't look back. And well, the other thing about it is, to use another baseball player's words, Satchel Paige used to say, never look back, something might be gaining on you.
Just keep running.
Just keep moving. Keep going forward.
So then birth of Isaac. Sarah is, Abraham is in old age, and Sarah's in her 90s, and we finally have a child. And there is part of the story that we did talk about this morning, that Isaac's name means laughter, because Sarah laughed when God told her that she would have a son. And so the part that they include in the book is about Abraham questioning God again about, you know, as old as she is, she's going to have a baby. And they leave the part out about, you know, the angel pointing out, you know, that Sarah says, at my age will I finally have pleasure. But the angel asks, why is Sarah laughing?
Well, why is she laughing, and why is she saying, how can I have a child at my age? That's not what she said. At my age, can I have pleasure, is what she said.
Yes. So anyway, I just find that funny that, you know, Isaac's name actually does mean laughter.
Yes, there's a lot of laughter, especially at that point of the story. I think that's the whole point, is they're trying to
we need
get
some
that
levity.
joyous laughter. Get the levity into it. But, you know, but so much of his story is sad after this.
Yeah, well, because
his name.
It follows with Hagar and Ishmael being sent away.
Yeah.
Right now that I have a real son.
Yeah.
Then, you know, and God is in that, you know, they are a distraction.
Yeah.
And that Abram, I mean, I think part of it is that Abram's love will be divided.
Yeah.
And will he love the first son more than Isaac?
Well, yeah, exactly.
And so Hagar and Ishmael are sent out into the wilderness. And then we have the binding of Isaac, where, you know, God asks Abraham to sacrifice the gift he just got. Like, what's that all about? So one of the things that we discussed in our small groups as we went out was, like, how do we wrestle with that story, right? How do we deal with, you know, you clearly shared the theory that, you know, really it was a test of Abraham, because Abraham has been arguing and, you know, in discussion, aggressive fellowship
with
yes,
God,
with God through, you know, all these other things, and then suddenly Abraham's like, okay, yeah, great.
Yeah.
And then it was a test of Abraham of, are you still willing to be in relationship with me? Are you still willing to be in dialogue with me? And Abraham doesn't, and it's a failure of Abraham,
right.
Not the fact
not to object.
Right.
Yeah. Well, there's mixed evidence from scholarship and history as to whether or not there were cultures that practiced human sacrifice back then. Some scholars say yes, there were a few, and some say there were none. But if there were a few, then that would not have been a strange request from God. It would be like the requests other gods made of their people. around Abraham. And, but if that were the case, Isaac would have come down from the mountain and said to all his friends, I came back from the mountain, unlike all your older brothers.
Well, and so we did talk about this too in our group was, what if Abraham had been honest with Isaac and said, God wants your life. Like, God is asking for you. Would Isaac have sacrificed himself? Would he have agreed to this? How old is Isaac, right? How old is Isaac? We don't really know his age. How does that change our okayness with this story based on whether we're talking about a little child versus a teenager or older, right? So we did talk a little bit about that.
Well, and the artwork you shared showed him as a young teen, really.
Yes. So I'm going to show them that in just a second. And then we had discussed in our groups as well, Abraham goes on this journey that God asks him to go on, to leave behind his home and everything that he's ever known. And so what might it have been like for us, or what would it be like for us to have to leave things behind, right, or people behind? What would we have to let go of in order to follow God's call? And then we also talked about Abraham encounters God in like unusual ways. Mm-hmm. And so, what are some of the unexpected ways that you might have experienced God in your own lives? And then finally, we talked about that Abraham argues. He's a great example for us to argue with God and bargain with God and calling on God to show mercy to people. And in fact, many of the faithful people in the Bible argue with God. And you pointed out that if you argue with God, what happens?
You usually meet him face to face. I mean, look at Abraham, Moses, and Job. They argued like crazy with God, and they also met him face to face, which was not always to their benefit, but.
Well, so we're trying to say, what does this mean about our faith, right? That, what does it mean for us as a people of faith that we have this history of people arguing with God and God still being present? Right.
Why do you think they called the nation in Palestine Israel? It's the story of the one who wrestles with God.
Yeah.
That's who we are. That's our identity. We're the people who wrestle with God.
Yes. Yeah. All right.
We'll talk more about that next week.
Yes, we will. All right. So I'm going to show them the artwork. You're welcome to stay with us, or we can see you next time, Father Stephen. But I'm going to share my screen with them and show them the artwork.
I'll watch the artwork for a minute.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna pull this up and we are gonna look at the artwork for, let me get to the right week. I think this is us. Nope, that's next week's. Right, this one.
It is right there.
So we are gonna do this start from current slide. All right, here we go. So we talk about Abraham leaving for Canaan. That's this, I think it's a pencil drawing over here on the left. That is, this is clearly Abraham and Sarah and all their stuff and persons heading out for Palestine. And then here is Abraham banishing Hagar and Ishmael, which brings about what we have talked about. Like, at what age do you imagine these people to be within the stories? Because here Ishmael is clearly still a young boy. Mm-hmm. All right, so we talked about this painting by Stome, that Sarah leading Hagar to Abraham, that Abraham kind of has this "you want me to do what" look on his face. And, he still is a tad bit muscular if you look at his arms, but we definitely have an older, weaker to some degree man here. And the reason I point that out is we talked later about like the binding of Isaac, that, if this is the Abraham that we're envisioning, it had to be a younger child, because no way is he going to be able to fight with a wrestling old young man who doesn't want to be bound, right? And then we talk, and here's Hagar, the Egyptian slave, and Sarah. This is Abraham gives food to the three strange guests.
The angels.
the angels. And so I pointed out that back here in the back foreground is what must be Hagar and Ishmael, again, the little boy, and Sarah over here behind the door.
Ah, yes. Listening in.
Yes. Okay, so this is Abraham and Isaac Rembrandt's rendition of the sacrifice. We noted that Abraham has his hand over Isaac's face. It appears that his hands are tied behind him, and the angel has to come in and grab his hand, which is kind of like this, what are you doing? Stop it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very aggressive move.
Yes. And then this is Reuben's take on the Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac and stopped by an angel. And so what we had referenced was, if you had looked at the Abraham in the first painting of where Hagar is presented to him, this is a much more able-bodied Abraham. Yeah. Yeah. And so again, the angel has come in and is intervening.
And notice the angel's arm, it's just kind of holding Abraham, not grabbing him and pulling away like Rembrandt.
Yes. Yeah. This is more of a discussion going on.
Hold on a minute. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. And Isaac's down here kind of like, I'm just kind of down here hanging out, like.
God, this is depressing. Now what?
Okay, so I think, so those are our artworks for this week. Next week, we are going to be talking about, the story doesn't end here. Never does. They're still at the very beginning.
Going to go all the way till April.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't end here with Abraham. Next week, the story continues as we hear about the covenant God makes with Abraham continued through his descendants, Jacob, the trickster, and Joseph the dreamer. They're both dreamers. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about Joseph and Jacob next week in chapter 4. So anything else, Father Stephen, you want to add before I close this in prayer?
Not that I can think of.
All right. Well, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
God and Father of all believers, for the glory of your name, multiply by the grace of the Paschal Sacrament the number of your children, that your church may rejoice to see fulfilled your promise to our father Abraham. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right. We'll see you next week, everybody.
See you next week, folks. Bye.